Good morning. So I'll be talking about contestations on parking policy. This is part of my thesis in my master's at CEPT University. This is one half of the presentation, which is looking at a study of planners and what are the issues of contestation that they have in terms of theoretical terms. The other part was a case study of Bangalore and the parking policy itself and the story of parking policy in Bangalore. So I'll quickly go into basically the issue. We have 14 metropolitan cities, 11 draft policies were made since 2006, 3 approved parking policies, Delhi, Bombay and Bangalore, 0 met the NUTP 2006 guidelines. It has been 9 years since JNURM mandated parking policies and 10 years since NUTP gave these guidelines. So it has been quite a while. It's not time that is the problem. There is something else that is an issue, and contestation is what my thesis is saying that might be the issue. Why this is important, this might be a slide that everybody's going to see multiple times this in the next few days. There's a lot more growth of automobiles in India and in urban India, and we're going to have to park them somewhere, and that's going to be an issue. The UDPFI reacts to it in terms of increasing the amount of parking supply that is required in buildings. But that has issues because that causes environmental and it's basically not a sustainable model in any case. So what is parking? Parking is basically a land use issue. It basically takes space. It needs to be parked somewhere. It also can be used for multiple other kinds of vehicles. It also can have an alternate use. It's the same amount, 25 square meters, which is EWS housing. So it has other uses. Parking is also a transport issue because you'd need to take a car or a vehicle from one point A, one land use, to the other. But that also means that there are multiple parking spaces for one vehicle. So it's more than 50 square meters and above that parking space requires for one vehicle. It also has an urban design and urban form issue. This just parking causes the pedestrian environment to look this bad. This is a case of Bangalore itself. And more importantly, it is an economic entity. It costs money, and it costs money to build, and that has implications in terms of embedded costs. So if you go to a mall, you're paying for the parking. You don't know it, but you're paying for it. And if you're also paying in terms of taxes, you're paying for the parking that's happening on the street. But nobody knows about it. When you buy an apartment, you don't know you're paying for the parking. But what if you never actually wanted a car park? You don't use cars. You're still paying for car parking. So that's a cost that really need not have been paid by a person who's using a sustainable mode, for example. So this is the basic layout. It's a land use transport issue, but it's also a sustainability and economic issue. This is two models of how increasing minimum parking requirements actually turns into a vicious cycle of automobile dependence. One by Richard Wilson is more detailed about the minimum parking requirements itself becoming an issue. But in the end, what are we trying to do? We're trying to look for solutions for accessibility. We need to go from point A to point B, and parking requirements is just one of those solutions, increasing parking requirements. There are multiple other supply-side solutions, but if we can go beyond it, there are demand-side solutions to parking as well, and there are land use and telecommunication solutions as well. So we are somehow looking at only one aspect of it as a solution. This is the conceptual framework for the study itself, and that basically what I was looking at was how do planners perceive the parking problem? What are the theoretical understandings that exist, and how does it turn into a policy option? It happens through a series of deliberation. There is consensus or contestation. And then that goes to the policy maker who sits in a council, for example, and then using public interest and public opinion and political environment makes another set of decisions that becomes the policy itself right at the end. Right now, we are low on the scale of justice, which is economic, environmental, and social justice, and hopefully with more deliberation and more reform, we go higher on the scale. So the objective was an exploration into whether appropriate conditions of change exist in the domain of parking reform in India. The existence of consensus among various stakeholders and high quality implementation are those factors that create that change. So I studied the first one through this survey, and the second issue was studied through the case study. So for the first issue, the two questions were, what are the policy issues regarding parking that lacks consensus among planners, and which of these issues are the most contested? The methodology basically started with a study of literature using grounded theory, which basically looks at coding all of the elements of the theory itself and making a statement out of it. The statement was then turned into questions which were asked of planners. and that was the quantitative part of it. It was plotted on Paul Barter's conceptual framework and typologies framework that he had developed. These are basically the three broad categories of issues that emerged: the nature of parking, parking policy, and strategic issues. This is from the literature, that is. 8 broad topics were listed down, which is turned into questions. I'll go into the questions later, so I'll just skip over this quickly. Just to look at what the parking approach is, and this is kind of important. Because Paul Barter says that there are 2 questions. If you answer it, you understand what the parking approach that is being adopted. The first question is, what is the emphasis of parking? Is it site-focused or is it area-focused? Area-focused is that you're trying to provide parking for the neighborhood. Site-focused is that you're looking at the site, the plot itself. So that is one question. The second question is parking a market good or is it infrastructure? Market good would be something that changes with supply-demand, and infrastructure is something that is mandated by, for instance, a bylaw. So what we exist right now is in the conventional site-focused approach, where we have no other mechanism. Generally in our cities, parking is free. We have no other mechanism but the bylaws that state we need to have so much of parking. This is a quick graphic of what happens in the conventional approach. We are afraid of on-street parking, and we want that to be built inside the buildings, and we have minimum parking requirements for it. In case it increases, that's the fear, there'll be more on-street parking, and then we increase the parking again, the requirements. But the problem is that on-street parking actually has a utility by itself, and that we are not calculating into this issue. And so we will continue to increase the minimum parking requirements, and then we might end up with a condition like this. This is not where we want to go. So there is 2 other approaches: area management approach and responsive approach. The area management approach looks at managing the parking at an area level itself. So in case parking increases, so the 2 components are that parking on street will be managed, and parking minimums, that is, there will be very low parking minimums or a parking cap. That's a maximum, that parking that you can provide inside the building. If in case it increases beyond that amount, the government would step in and create some kind of parking for that neighborhood itself, which kind of makes it efficient. The last one is what Donald Shoup emphasizes on, which is that there are 2 problems. Queuing and cruising for on-street parking is the issue. And basically, he believes that the market will be able to do the planning, which means that the amount of parking that happens inside a building will be understood by the developer through the demand that his customers provide. And so basically, by charging enough parking charges that removes 20% of the people who are parking on street, you create enough free spaces, and that is the utility, basically, the free spaces that ensures that people are not looking for parking, because nowadays a lot of people are spending time just looking for parking in cities like Bangalore and Mumbai. And then by deregulating parking requirements altogether from the bylaws, what is required is what is created by the developers. So the last question what he looks at is how much of parking should be supplied? Is it plenty, match what is the demand, or constraint? So this is the 3-dimensional framework, which is what the responses are plotted on. These are the questions. I'm going to quickly go past them. I will look at it in the results. So the survey was basically done. It was an online questionnaire which sent out 20 questions, 16 of which was analyzed using a consensus measure. So basically the results you see in the bottom are of one of the questions, for example. And the Tassel and Wehrman's consensus measure was used because basically the mean never really tells you whether the consensus exists at that mean or not. And hence, this consensus measure was used. So the consensus measure, basically, the strength of consensus measure tells you between 0.5 and 1, if it crosses 0.7, there is some kind of consensus on the issue. And it also tells you on which direction the consensus exists. So whether they agree or whether they disagree on the issue. So 44 responses were there, 40 valid responses came in, and mostly these were professionals working in the parking domain itself. So planning consultants, NGOs, academics. And all of them had roughly an average experience of 8 years in the field. These are the results of the survey. Basically 16 questions were asked, disagrees on the left, agrees on the right, and the consensus measures on the right as well. So what we find is that of the 6 issues that were looked at with multiple questions, Paul Barter's parking approach, the 3 questions for that, revealed that there is consensus among planners that the responsive approach, which is Donald Shoup's, the most radical kind of approach, is the one that everybody agrees on, which is very surprising. The second one, what was the parking problem? there was no consensus on two of the issues, which is spillover the issue in parking, or is queuing and cruising the issue in parking? There was no consensus on that, but there was consensus that increasing travel demand is the issue in parking. The third issue was responsibility to supply parking. Is it a government problem? Is it the problem of an individual to take care of it? And there was no consensus whether the government should be taking care of it, but there was definitely consensus that the individual should be responsible for it. Unbundling of off-street parking. That was the next question. Complete agreement that parking costs should be unbundled, and FSI, for example, is also one kind of a subsidy that it should not be free of FSI parking. On-street parking, surprisingly, had no consensus. The questions asked were whether we should reduce parking eventually and completely remove it, or whether there should be charges for residents and visitors in a neighborhood. There was no consensus on the issue. They were kind of tricky issues as well. Parking and ride. This was the most controversial of issues because there is complete consensus that park and ride should be provided in mass transit. But the literature says that that actually increases the amount of vehicle kilometers traveled. And all of us agree that park and ride should be provided along park and ride, and that along metros and BRTS. And that's a problematic issue. The other two questions that were asked were commercial establishments, whether they profit from extra parking. There was no consensus on it. And whether a parking fees collected by the government should be a disincentive. There was consensus that it should be a disincentive and not looked at as revenue. So 16 questions were asked. 6 questions had no consensus on it, which is pretty good actually. So 10 questions we had consensus on. And what we see finally is that 68% of the responses on the 2D graph are on the responsive approach, which is great. And 76% is in the H&I category, which is again great in the 3D approach. So this is putting in context where the Bangalore's parking policy exists right now, and then kind of looking at where planners have responded currently. So the Bangalore's existing condition is basically in A, which is that we have a conventional approach, which is providing plenty of parking. The approved policy was nudging towards the area planning approach, where it said that the government should make more built structured parking and maybe charge parking a little bit here and there. But the draft policy was a very strong one. The approved policy was quite diluted. The draft policy was firmly in the area planning management approach. But where the planners are, who have responded to the survey, is in H&I, which is far higher. So when you look at all the institutions together, you find that although there is consensus among planners, when it comes down to different institutions and then putting them together, we have consensus only on 5 issues out of 16. And that, again, is another troublesome issue. So to conclude, basically, there is a lack of consensus among different institutions and among the policy makers as well. Planners could work now as consensus builders, and that's something that we need to probably look at. Also, there's a fear of public backlash, and it has happened in Bombay. The case of Bombay is very strong. But the public needs to be part of the process, and if they're not part of the process, they will not understand what the issues are, and they will respond in a different way. So if you tell them the benefits of unbundling parking, for example, and that you're not paying for certain other person's expenses, it will make rational sense. The second issue is everybody says we cannot charge parking because it's not affordable. How will people be able to afford it? But again, that is not the issue. We're charging parking to enable accessibility for others and accessibility for all people. And that should be a concern, and not really looking at charging kind of the rich. That should not really bother us at all. And the last issue I would think, which is the most important, is that the reform process is an incremental process. Richard Wilson, in his Parking Reforms Made Easy, the book, says exactly this, that it is an incremental process. You need to set up a framework in a policy and not really spell out everything that has to be done tomorrow. And if you go out to actually implement what everything has to be done tomorrow, we will fail. So can we look at it as an incremental process, do one step at a time, and then we'll probably have more of a solution at the end of it. Thank you.